Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. The State Historical Society is commemorating the upcoming 175th anniversary of Iowa statehood, which takes place in a few days on December 28. We are excited to announce that the Iowa History 101 webinar series, which focuses on the past lives of Iowans, will continue on the second and fourth Thursdays in 2022. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend. And don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we will hear a conversation about the movie It's a Wonderful Life, which has become a holiday tradition and a feel-good Hollywood tale of redemption. Now that 75 years have passed since its premiere, the movie also offers a glimpse into the history at a turbulent era when Americans confronted many challenges that are still unsettled today. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speakers. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, our co-presenters, Leo Landis and Christopher Wilson. Leo Landis is a state curator and has his Bachelor's of Science in History from Iowa State University and a Master's of Arts in Historical Administration from Eastern Illinois University. He has completed all but his dissertation towards a PhD in history from Iowa State. His museum's experience includes time at Living History Farms in Urbandale, Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, and 8 years as curator at Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. He has also worked as curator and director of education at Salisbury House in Des Moines. Christopher Wilson is the Director of Experience Design and the African American History Program for the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. In leading both these initiatives, Christopher works to engage visitors in conversations about our nation's rich and diverse history. Christopher founded 3 major program series at the National Museum of American History. It's History Alive Theater programs, the National Youth Summit series, and the History Film Forum, which is a film festival and discussion forum exploring history on the screen. The director of the African American History Program since 2004, Christopher oversees the program's rich cultural of oral histories, interviews, and recordings. He strives to use the programming to enrich the experiences of every visitor by offering them a glimpse into the rich history and culture of Black Americans and an understanding that the American experience springs from many diverse stories. He holds an MA in History from Wayne State University and a BA in History and English Language and Literature from the University of Michigan. And now I'm very happy to turn over to Christopher and Leo to begin the webinar.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. And it's great to have people from all over and former or longtime friends and maybe first-time attendees joining us for this discussion. And Chris and I worked together for almost 7 years at Greenfield Village, or Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village, or the Henry Ford as it's known today. And I remember one of my, I've loved this film since the 1980s when it was in that long rotation, but one of my first years in Michigan, some of Chris's coworkers then at Firestone Farm hosted a It's a Wonderful Life party that is still a warm memory for me in the December of 1997, I think was the year. And so knowing this film and knowing Chris has a long history with it as well as a viewer and a historian, we on the anniversary of the 75th anniversary of this film wanted to talk about the historical themes that show up. And so know that most people know this film, but just to set it up a little bit, the 2 stars, of course, are in the center of the image that you see, Donna Reed and Jimmy Stewart. And they play the characters, Jimmy Stewart as George Bailey, the hero in the film, and then Donna Reed as Mary Hatch Bailey. Other characters going from right to left that we'll reference at different times, and I'll hit a couple other characters too, are Annie, who is the Bailey's maid on the far right, then Mrs. Bailey, George's mother, then of course George and Mary, then Mrs. Hatch, and then that's Ernie, the cab driver on the far left, and right behind him is Mr. Gower, the drugstore owner. And they are all characters in the film. The film is set on December 24th, so Christmas Eve, 1945. World War II is over, and it really is a march of American history in the film from, we know at least the late teens up till 1945. Christmas Eve, 1945 is the concluding date of the film. A couple other characters. It's set in Bedford Falls, of course, so to name the place, Bedford Falls, presumably in New York. New York towns get mentioned throughout the film: Rochester, Elmira, New York City. Then what is, of course, the background on the film? George, as a building and loan operator that he had taken over from his father, and his not followed his personal dreams, but stayed in his hometown of Bedford Falls to operate the building and loan. His uncle Billy has lost $8,000 to Mr. Potter, who is the miserly bank owner in Bedford Falls. That's played by Lionel Barrymore there in the third image on the left. And so George, the bank is in trouble. The building loan, I should say, is in trouble that day on Christmas Eve because Uncle Billy has inadvertently given Mr. Potter $8,000 of deposits. And George, not knowing what to do, is ready to commit suicide. And the angels in heaven, knowing the challenge that George is facing, send down Clarence Oddbody, angel second class, to try to help George and realize that his life is much richer and the world is a much better place because of him. So a long setup there, but that gives you the main characters. And so I want to start out, Chris, by opening up the scene where they're at Mr. Gower's drugstore, and Mr. Gower is despondent and also inebriated. And so, set that up for us if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, and thank you for asking me to take part in this. Leo and I and a colleague of mine and a couple other historians just recently participated in a discussion about the same topic, and with our History Film Forum series at the Smithsonian, where we really realized that, as Leo said, as Clarence is getting this sort of assignment to take the case of George Bailey, he has to get some background information. Clarence is ready to head down immediately and start helping George, but one of his advisors says, well, if you want to learn something, you want to help a man, you need to learn something about him, right? So he sits down, and much of the movie then is this background briefing on George, but is also a history lesson for Clarence and the viewers from that period of 1919 to 1945. And so the first scene we see is Harry Bailey, George's brother, falling through the ice in 1919 as they're sledding. He and George and all their friends are sledding on thin ice, and he falls through. George has the presence of mind, probably because he read, to create a chain and have the kids all lie on the ice and go hand to foot and make a chain that saves Harry. George just dives into the cold water. And as a result, George catches a cold, and that cold causes an infection in his ear, and he loses his hearing in that ear. And it's weeks before he can go back to his after-school job at Old Man Gower's drugstore. And so the second scene that we and Clarence see is George going back to that job and making his eventual wife Mary a sundae and behind the counter. But also, as he's doing that, looks on the cash register and sees a telegram that Mr. Gower, who is in the back of the drugstore, despondent, really annoyed that George is whistling as he does his work, and Mr. Gower barks at him, "You're not paid to be a canary." And then George figures out why, which is this telegram that's sitting on the cash register that says, "We regret to inform you that your son Robert very suddenly this morning died of influenza." And of course, what they're talking about is a history that that is really relevant to us today, the flu pandemic, the influenza pandemic of 1919, which affected people all over the country and all over the world. And so we see that bit of world history coming into the story right there and affecting Mr. Gower and George and the rest of Bedford Falls.
And I think what's important to remember in this too, Chris, and I know we've talked about it, is the pandemic, of course, of 1918 starts in the spring. It really comes in raging in fall of late summer, fall of 1918, but it really does last into 1920. So the idea that the pandemic of what most of us consider 1918 is still around in 1919 is not out of the ordinary. And I think that's a good historical lesson for us to consider today. I think we're all in our own way doing what we can to alleviate the current pandemic, and just to be patient and understand that these sorts of new diseases, the influenza H1N1 of 1918, really took a while to be addressed. And thankfully today we have vaccines. They didn't in 1918 and 1919.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's move to the next scene. And George jumps quite a bit actually from that boyhood, as Chris said, working for Emil Gower, Old Man Gower at his drugstore. And so the next scene is as George is headed toward his home and encounters Bert the cop and Ernie, or there's a couple of other scenes in there, I should say, but the next major scene that really relates to US history is Bert the police officer, or Bert the cop, and Ernie the taxi driver along the street. And so looking at that headline, Chris, do you want to put that in any context for us?
You know what? I'm sorry. I hadn't seen that one before.
That's all right. I can take it too, because I know we both. So Bert the cop has his newspaper, which is the Bedford Falls newspaper, and it's Smith wins the nomination. And this is where it's always a good lesson not to use film as real history. There's a little lack of continuity that I'll reference between the next set of slides. This, of course, is referencing Al Smith, who's going to be the Democratic nominee. He really doesn't lock up the Democratic nomination for the presidency until July of 1918. And yet this is the day of Harry Bailey's graduation. So George's younger brother, Harry Bailey's graduation party that's going to be in Bedford Falls. And so this is actually a day that has a whole lot of treatment within the film, starting with George encountering Bert and Ernie. And the big issue in 1928 connected to Governor Smith, he's former governor of New York, is he's Catholic. And so this is the first time a Roman Catholic candidate is going to be nominated by a major party. And also the issue of the day, as is referenced in the film, at least one of them is prohibition. And as a Catholic, and this was true in Iowa and across the nation, Catholics tended to be local option supporters, not supportive of national prohibition. Thought it should be up to area communities. And so the issue that gets played out, among others, with Governor Smith is that will the Democrats put a wet plank in their platform for 1928? But for that headline to truly be accurate, it needs to be July of 1928. It's right around, I think, maybe it's late June, but it doesn't fit with the continuity of the film if they're having a graduation party for the graduation class of 1928. So that part works. It's just the month sequence that's a little off. And so, of course, would be remiss not to say that 1928 is also the year that native son of Iowa, Herbert Hoover, who was nationally popular and important former Secretary of Commerce, but also had done World War I famine relief in Europe, and so is nationally and internationally loved, is going to be the Republican nominee, and it's the only native Iowan who has won the presidency, of course. And so that's the scene set up in this little taxi cab scene. Is there's no date, of course, on the newspaper, but to know the time frame on when Smith gets the nomination, it has to be a little later in the summer. Anything else you want to chime in on 1928? We're going to jump to Prohibition here in a second.
Well, you know, I was going to say that the other big elephant or snuffleupagus in the room there is whether Bert and Ernie are, you know, the progenitors of the names Bert and Ernie for Sesame Street. And I think the answer is we don't really know. That we've heard, but it's likely not, that it's just it's a coincidence that that those names. But you know, I know as a kid I noticed that it was Bert and Ernie, and several times Jimmy Stewart in his inimitable accent or speech quality says Bert, Ernie, and you know, you can't help but notice that it's Bert and Ernie. So I just sort of always assumed that they were that the Muppets were based on them, but it seems not. I guess it's still possibly likely. I've never heard anything completely definitive that as to what Bert and Ernie were named after. If they were not named after them, or maybe it just was just, you know, the names that were picked. But I'd still rather think that Bert and Ernie somehow inspired the other Bert and Ernie, the more famous Bert and Ernie.
And I agree entirely with that summation. We just don't really know. I think Children's Television Workshop and Jim Henson, have been kind of, or it would be Jim Henson really, have been, you know, kind of ambivalent in answering that. So it's a we don't really know. And good comment to pull out, Chris.
I should say one other again, not history thing, but just as we started talking about Clarence getting his instructions in the heavens, the initial scene, many people who've seen the film would be familiar with, is you start seeing these, you know, stars or celestial bodies kind of light up as the angels are talking, and the angels, we do hear one of them named Joseph, and Clarence later, you know, calls out to Joseph to help him when Bert the cop arrests him later on. But in the film, in the screenplay, the other angel or celestial body isn't named at all. But in the original script, that other angel was, and I think actually in the final script, the angel is known as Franklin. In the original script, the angel was Benjamin Franklin. And that initial scene that takes place in heavens, or, you know, with just the lights, was intended to be in Benjamin Franklin's office, in a live action, you know, version of that scene. I don't know why they picked, you know, why it was intended to be Benjamin Franklin exactly, but that was the original way that scene was devised, and the name Franklin made it into the screenplay, even in the end.
That's a really great little nugget of history on the film. So thanks for including that. Not the next scene. I'm going to skip a scene and have Chris talk about it a little bit more, but on the next set of slides, I should say, George and Harry get home, and that would be the next scene in the film, but I'm jumping ahead to the Charleston Contest, and then we'll jump back to the dinner scene at the Bailey household, Chris, and I'll let you carry that one a little bit more. But again, if you know this film, there's a grand Charleston Contest. The banner does say, "Congratulations, graduating class of Bedford Falls, 1928." I'm paraphrasing that a little bit, but because of the Al Smith headline on the newspaper, we know it's 1928, and Capra and the screenwriters are true to that date in the sequence. And so it's a Charleston Contest. And I've done a lot of research on my own in Iowa in the 1920s. Those of you who followed some of our Iowa 101s have heard me talk about Iowa in the Jazz Age, and the concern over dancing styles that was typical in the period. because the Charleston isn't a cheek-to-cheek dance, it's not quite as controversial or viewed as vulgar because dancers are apart, whereas the bunny hug or the Texas toddle, some of the grizzly bear, those were cheek-to-cheek dances and were viewed as vulgar and inappropriate. But a Charleston was mostly okay. And in Iowa and across the nation, late 1925, early 1926 is the era. So that's again where the film is a little off sequence. Charleston dances were still, contests were still happening in 1928, but not the rage they were in 1926. And so early 1926, Davenport, for any non-Iowans, is on the eastern border, one of our larger towns, part of the Quad Cities, today usually regarded as Davenport, Rock Island, Moline, and Bettendorf. At the time, it was the Tri-Cities, sometimes the Quad Cities. And East Moline was a bigger town than Bettendorf. And so I love that graphic on the far right image of the Charleston contest. That's coming from January 5th. And then going to our other border up on the northwest, west central part of the state, you've got a Sioux City Journal ad, almost the same date, one day later. Excuse me, I jumped. There's another description saying that there's money, I should say, in the second clipping. That's a description of the Davenport contest, that there's going to be money awarded. And then the third clipping is the Sioux City clipping, so the western border, and referencing the contest there and running it a day later in the paper. And then in just Oskaloosa, a little southeast of Des Moines, the county seat of Mahaska County, it connected to a lot of coal mining communities. And in Iowa, coal mining was an opportunity for Black Americans to have a degree of equality. The well-known town to Iowans, Buxton, had closed down by 1926, but the Oskaloosa had a history of being a Quaker community, so had historically been tolerant toward Blacks. But as you can see in that Oskaloosa ad from February 17th, 1926, Oskaloosa is holding a segregated set of contests. So whites only on the Thursday night, and then for Blacks on the Friday night contest. So sometimes Iowans, we like to give ourselves credit, but for being pretty progressive, but there certainly was segregation in our state. And that's just one good example of it persisting into that interwar period, the 1920s. And so that's, again, don't go to films necessarily for history. Charleston contests were kind of on their way out by 1928, but in 1926, they were the rage. And so the scene before that contest, of course, is a scene at the Bailey household, and really the first time when you see this character, Annie, the maid for the Baileys. And so I'll step away and let Chris talk about her a little bit.
Sure. So Annie is played by Lillian Randolph, who was a really spectacularly talented actor and singer, but one who had a hard time getting roles that she thought, were not demeaning and so forth. So she ended up playing a lot of maid, mammy type characters, including in films as well as in cartoons, Tom and Jerry cartoons and so forth. When she took the roles that she could get. One of the things I think that is notable about It's Wonderful Life, when you look on it as this history lesson of 1919 to 1945, you mostly would come away with that thinking that African Americans were non-existent in the history of small town America from that time, except, as a domestic, in a domestic capacity. And so we, a number of years ago, working at the museum when we first started our history film forum, I came across an artist in New York named Dylan Marin, who was doing a project called Every Single Word. And he was taking popular films, past and present, and cutting them down to every single word spoken by a person of color, an actor of color in these films. Many films literally got down to the credits and the end credits and nothing in between. And these were films from everything from really, something like Star Wars or Jaws or something like that, to to the Lord of the Rings series, to any number of things he was doing this with. We asked him then to do that same treatment with some history films, and so we found the same thing, that much of the time the status of filmmaking and who got roles and what stories were told in Hollywood caused for history to be told without whole groups of people. And so we actually decided to do the same thing with It's a Wonderful Life. And if you cut down the film to the words spoken by an actor of color, it's just Lillian Randolph, and it takes the 131-minute film down to about 2 minutes or even less if you don't really have the reactions of Jimmy Stewart to her words and so forth. But Annie comes into play in a number of scenes, most prominently around the dinner. So this is also 1928. This is after Harry has left to his graduation party, where they have the Charleston Contest, and George and his father continue to sit at the dinner table and have a conversation about what's going to happen next. Harry has graduated high school, and is going to take over George's job at the Building and Loan. This was the agreement, while George, who has delayed college for 4 years, finally gets to head off and head off on a trip to Europe and then begin college. But his father says, would you consider staying on at the Building and Loan? And while they're deep in conversation about that, Annie, as she is in this scene, listens to the conversation, and George notices that she's eavesdropping, and then says, well, Annie, why don't you draw up a chair, and then you could be more comfortable and hear everything that is going on. And Annie says, well, I would if I would hear anything worth listening to. And then they continue the conversation, and it's presented as really Annie being a part of the family. Annie's interested in the conversation. Annie is very much admiring of Peter Bailey, George's father, and the work that he's done. Peter Bailey and George are really men for others. Peter has spent his whole life, and at this point, George wants to go off exploring and do other things, but George ends up spending his whole life working for other people and so forth, and is presented as Annie, really respects that and so forth, and is also part of the family. And so in that way, I think there's some tenderness presented there. But immediately before this scene, there is the commotion as Harry and others are getting ready to head to the graduation dance and so forth. And Harry, the 17 or 18-year-old boy of the household, ends up chasing Annie around the table, saying, Annie, I'm in love with you. There's a moon out tonight. And just as she runs through the kitchen door, as the stage directions say in the film, Harry slaps her on her fanny and she screams. And then Mrs. Bailey sits down at the table. Well, that's sexual assault in the workplace, and it's really just presented as a funny little scene, and I think it really is emblematic of kind of how African Americans are even treated in this if we think of It's a Wonderful Life, and this part of It's a Wonderful Life really being a story of America 1919 to 1945. African Americans, as represented by Annie, are either non-existent or invisible, or treated as as an object, or as the butt of jokes, and so forth, and comic relief for the film. So I think that's really an unfortunate part of the film. And if we think about just the difference in perspective, if this had been a young Black character, 17-year-old, 18-year-old boy, Black boy, chasing around a character like Mary, a 50-year-old woman who is seen as somewhat even receptive of this sexual assault and attention, and certainly it's not seen as there's anything wrong with it. I think that there's some real issues that arise from this scene and that depiction.
I agree entirely. The sexual harassment and assault is certainly something that needs to be considered and criticized and recognized in the film. So thanks for bringing that up, Chris. And just something that we all should reflect on as you watch the film and feel good about it, but also recognize that it actually has some darker issues at times too, and the way it treats African Americans, the way it treats Blacks. Well, this day, as Chris has talked and I have talked, is a monumental day in the film, because it starts out with George planning to go on a trip to Europe and then go to college, and it's Harry Bailey's graduation, and then they go, and George connects with Mary Hatch at the Charleston Contest, as we showed, and there's then a memorable scene that we really don't have time to get into too much detail on, where Harry and Mary are, George and Mary are having an interchange as George has walked her home following the dance contest and going into the pool that really is the case at Beverly Hills High School. Anyway, that interchange between Mary and George is disrupted by a call saying Peter Bailey has died, and so George ends up taking over the building and loan, and then is trying to decide what to do with his life. And it leads up to about 4 years later, where he is back at the Hatch house, and another character, Sam Wainwright, that we haven't talked about, but who is a erstwhile suitor of Mary Hatch as well, but probably not interested in her, as we come to find out. But Mrs. Hatch does not think much of George Bailey. And so here's the scene, and I'll set this piece up, Chris, and then send it back to you. So Sam's on the telephone. Mary has been trying to play a record for George, and he wants nothing to hear about the Buffalo Gals music. And so Sam calls, Mary's on the phone downstairs, Mrs. Hatch is on the phone upstairs. And so George and Mary are on the phone together, and Sam says, well, look, I have a big deal coming up that's going to make us all rich. George, you remember that night in Martinis Bar when you told me you read someplace about making plastics out of soybeans? And then an unidentified voice says, chili beans. Sam says, shut up, will you? You remember? Out of soybeans. And George then says, huh? Yeah, soybeans, yeah. And so this, again, is a real historical reference, as Chris and I know very well from our time together in Michigan. So take it away, Chris.
Yeah, well, so first of all, there's so much going on in that scene. I remember just as a kid, my parents loved it. So and loved this particular part of it. George has come over to the Hatch house, and then Sam calls, and Mrs. Hatch is really interested in Mary talking to Sam and picking up the phone, but George and Mary have a fight. Mary's not that interested in doing that, and then Sam says, well, if George is over there, I want to talk to him. And then one of the what I've always loved is the look on Mrs. Hatch's face when she says, he doesn't want to talk to Sam, you idiot. But then that's because Mrs. Hatch is on the extension upstairs listening in. That's why George and Mary have to be, listening into the same earpiece of the single phone downstairs. And so we hear, and there's all of this tension in this scene as the two of their faces are close together and so forth. And so you're not intended to really listen to what Sam is saying on the other end of the line, and the way they've recorded it is, it's sounding like it's a few inches away from both of their ears. So, but if you do listen, you hear what Leo just said, that Sam brings up this idea that George, who was a voracious reader and interested in science and so forth, you can imagine George picking up a pamphlet like The Industrialized American Barn, somewhere or something in National Geographic magazine or something, and learning about this idea of making plastics out of soybeans, and saying, wow, isn't it amazing modern age we live in when this could happen. And mostly this is just this kind of throwaway line, because what you're really supposed to be paying attention to is this tension between George and Mary that all of a sudden explodes in them kissing and the next scene immediately after this is them getting married and so forth. But if you're like Leo and me, you ears perk up and you say, what, soybeans? And so what they're really talking about there is a process called chemurgy, or an idea called chemurgy that really started in the 1920s, went to the 1940s, and was popularized most prominently by Henry Ford. Henry Ford was really, so he was obsessed with a lot of things. One of those things was finding better sources for raw materials, so you could control all of the parts of making a car. And one of the things that he was really felt that he was being swindled by was rubber as well as plastic, but particularly rubber was one of the big issues for him. And really all over the country and all over the world, he sought ways to kind of get around the production line and that raw materials issue. At the same time, he was very much interested in helping farmers, and he saw this problem that was happening all over the country, including very much in Iowa, of farmers not getting good prices for their commodities, and particularly grains. And so he felt that with science, and this is what chemurgy really was, that there had to be a way to use those agricultural products in industrial applications. And if we just use the genius of the modern scientific age and find ways to use those products and turn them into something like a plastic car, then could we grow a car which would help with the supply chain issues, as well as give a market for farmers and their crops that lacked value, and really help everyone. Henry Ford had a lot of ideas that he thought, well, if he could implement all these ideas, he could change society and change the world and so forth. And they were all could be unlocked by his brain and his wealth. And so one of the things he did was in Dearborn, Michigan, the headquarters of Ford Motor Company, but really all over the place, set scientists working on finding industrial uses for crops, and sometimes not just crops, but things like dandelion seeds. And so, one of the buildings at Greenfield Village, that's one of the only buildings it was built there for a purpose other than, the historical education purpose, or, was moved there as a historic building, was the Industrial Research Laboratory, which ended up being called the Soybean Laboratory because they had most success in this chemurgy process on soybeans there. But initially they were experimenting on everything. Leo and I, in their research there, talked to one of the scientists there who had spent, weeks or months, experimenting on cantaloupes and trying to find, can you make some industrial product from cantaloupes? Same thing with dandelion seeds. We heard the story that at some point, as the Henry Ford was driving around Detroit and Dearborn, saw a field of grass with dandelion seeds, dandelions gone to seed, and thought, you have to be able to make something from them. And if you can, there's so many of them, that would be cheap. So scientists went around with vacuums, one vacuum that's fixed to an automobile, sucking up dandelion seeds. After a certain amount of time of dousing them with acetone and trying different things, they realized, no, you can't make anything out of dandelion seeds. But they had to give it a try. But they were able to synthesize protein and oil directly from soybeans using chemical processes, and resulted in creating some soybean plastics, like a cover. So this is really a cover of the hood of the trunk of Henry Ford's personal car that he then famously hit with an axe to show that it was plastic and not metal. They made gear shift knobs and so forth. Eventually, there were easier and cheaper ways to make plastics out of petroleum rather than soybean oil and so forth. And so when in later scenes in It's Wonderful Life, talking about World War II, it is said that Sam Wainwright makes a fortune making plastic canopies for fighter aircraft in World War II. The implication is that might have been out of soybeans. That didn't really happen in terms of soybean plastic, but one of the things that did happen was this ability to synthesize oil and protein and things like lecithin from soybeans did revolutionize the soybeans as foods, revolutionize soybeans in the food industry, and really result in soybeans being the crop that it is today. It really was a marginal crop before Henry Ford's publicization, whatever word I'm trying to use there, of this idea of soy as the future, and those experiments and that knowledge that they came from experimenting with soybean really made that industrial research laboratory or soybean laboratory kind of a mother church of the American soybean industry.
So well said, Chris. And as Chris pointed out, the Henry Ford photo is in Greenfield Village, Henry Ford's personal car, shot from 1941. The industrialized American barn was at the Chicago World's Fair of 1933. Ford had moved a barn and was actually demonstrating the extraction of soybean oil and the protein, as Chris referenced, at the Chicago World's Fair. So a lot of Southeast Michiganders who are older remember the rotunda that used to be in Dearborn. That was also at the World's Fair, but the Kimmergic building that was there was the industrialized American barn to address that movement that Chris was referencing. There's so much good history in this film that we want to make sure to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to jump forward and move us to the run on the bank, which is when, or the run on the Bailey Building and Loan. You always need to remember the building and loan is different than the bank. The bank is Mr. Potter's operation. And so, as Chris said, you do have a wedding between George and Mary, and as they're getting ready to take off to the Bahamas and or somewhere in the Pacific, excuse me, the Atlantic, off of the Florida coast.
I think it's actually Bermuda.
Yeah, Bermuda. There you go. I knew it was right off the Florida, near the Florida coast. Shouldn't say right off, but Bermuda's not too far. Thank you. That there's a run on the bank, and that certainly, though Donna Reed's born in 1921, so in the period of the run on the bank, this is probably going to be sometime between 1930 to 1932-ish. 1931 was the big era of bank runs, at least in Iowa, and bank closures. So that notice from the Denison Bulletin is a small town near where Donna Reed grew up. So as a girl, she certainly was familiar with the banking challenges, and Jimmy Stewart, of course, would have been too, but bringing in the Iowa lens. And just a couple of more references, as I said, 1931 is at least in Crawford County. Again, for non-Iowans, that's west central Iowa. It's on the Lincoln Highway. It was a county seat town. Her parents had a small farm just south and east of town on the corner of a land section in Nishnabotny Township, Crawford County, Iowa. So she was the oldest in her family. One of the stories, and so she was a farm girl, then went to town while she was in high school, was that, she was fairly good at farming as a young woman, but also fairly physical. And so at the scene where she's wishing on the abandoned house that she and George end up purchasing, she really did throw the rock that breaks the window. That's the story you hear. And if I'm wrong, Chris, you can correct me, but Donna Reed had some skills. So just want to put that little context in there as well. And then
Well,
Go
let me,
ahead.
I'll just quickly say too that, I mean, Mary Bailey doesn't get quite enough credit, I don't think, for also having a wonderful life, and also being, a person who buoys up the community. Because in that scene, there's an actual run on the bank, Henry F. Potter's bank, or the bank that he takes over because of the beginning of the Depression there, and the stock market crash, and at the same time, the shareholders of the building and loan go to pull their shares out. And George is explaining that that's not how a building and loan works, that they don't have all of the money back in a safe, and that if everyone pulls their shares out, it would ruin the organization. And it's really much more of a cooperative financial institution. But Mary's the one who says, I have $2,000, which is both of their life savings, that they're going to be spending on their honeymoon. And she, they offer up really maybe an early version of microloans, of $20 or $17.50 to one of the shareholders there. And so so she comes up with that idea later in the film. She's the one who really gathers all of George's friends and the police to save George's life, and so forth. And so Mary needs some credit there, and including in this next scene that you're going to talk about, Leah.
Yeah, so Bailey Building and Loan creates a place called Bailey Park, and one of the local tavern operators is Mr. and Mrs. Martini, an Italian family. Frank Capra was an Italian immigrant, and this plays into the 1930s New Deal program of the Federal Home Administration, where the federal government's really trying to promote home ownership again, and so it gets played out through the Bailey Building and Loan, and the Martinis getting a house. And that scene is Mrs. Martini on the left, leaving their rental property, and you do see a young African American, a young Black child in the background. Again, Blacks being almost exclusively in the background in the film, other than Annie, and very rarely seen. But you also know they're Catholic, and that was, going back to the Al Smith issue, something that was controversial in the 1920s for some people. That was what Klan activity was connected to. And so the Martinis getting their own home is a monumental day. And as Chris says, it's Mary plays an instrumental role, Donna Reed's character, in giving them bread and salt. And then Jimmy Stewart's character, George Bailey, as they get their home, gives them wine. And so anything else you want to chime in there, Chris, on that scene?
I mean, just that, as you said, Frank Capra was an Italian-American, from an Italian-American family. And, he probably thought of this, the inclusion of a strong and proud Italian family with an obvious Catholic background, as diversity, and showing that, because this wasn't really done. This was diversity for a Hollywood movie of the time, and I think that this was this was his kind of homage to this history where more than 4 million Italians would have immigrated to the United States between 1880 and 1920 in the 20s, and they were facing discrimination and so forth. That's referenced in the film. George is really trying to help people get out of Mr. Potter's slums, and his greatest achievement in life really is creating Bailey Park, which is this housing project that allows people to achieve the American dream in a way and get out from under a greedy landlord like Potter and so forth. And so I think that Capra really is showing this level of kind of it's somewhat still stereotypical. They have goats in their house, and they a million kids, and things like, there's some sort of stereotypes and the kind of broken English that Mr. Martini uses at some points. but he's still, Capra is really trying to show that lovingly and as a strong, American family, a family that with the help of organizations and people like the Baileys is becoming a strong part of American society. And so I think that was really at play here too.
And that reference that you were getting at when Potter is criticizing George Bailey for the work that he's doing, he says, George, what have you done with your life? And I'm going to get the quote almost accurate, if not exact, you're a nursemaid to a bunch of garlic eaters. So it's not the worst slur toward Italians, but certainly, and as gets represented in the sequence where George has never lived and Martinis Bar is gone, and then Nick, who is the character that is Martini's bartender, then owns the bar in Pottersville. That's the George never lived scene. That's the last 40 minutes of the film, essentially, or 30 of the last 40 minutes of the film. Nick's bar in the tawdry Pottersville has it's a gin joint with a black piano player and women with low cut tops in some cases. And so the way that anti-Italian sentiments are brought out is in a slur from Mr. Potter, but also Italian Americans as outsiders and being sometimes in the stereotype, as Chris referenced, is part of organized crime and leading to a more vulgar establishment than Martini's was. And so this is the scene, and we really don't have time to get into it, where Clarence and George are ordering drinks at Martini's Bar and then get thrown out in the Pottersville era. And want to jump ahead to that last scene and jump to some questions for our last few minutes. But as Chris referenced, it's Mary who puts together the community effort to get the $8,000 to help take care of the debt that is owed to the bank. We're covering the amount of money that the building loan needs to have deposited at the bank to ensure that they're solvent. In the scene on the right, that's Harry Bailey, the war hero. That's kind of the last little newspaper reference is Uncle Billy and George both have newspapers from Bedford Falls that show President Truman awarding Harry Bailey the Distinguished Service Medal for his service in World War II, most notably shooting down 2 planes that were going to crash into a transport ship. So he's a flying ace. And it's again another scene where Annie is depicted in the background on that left image, and then one other black character in the background in the main image. And I'll give you a couple minutes on that, Chris, but we need to wrap up here in about 8 minutes. So I want to get to some of the questions too that we have.
Yeah, sure. Not I don't think too much on that yet. I think that this, just before the Pottersville scenes that we hear a description of the history of World War II, and it's a very community oriented depiction that Capra gives, that really everybody in the town was playing a role, including George, who was 4F and couldn't fight because of his ear infection as a child, but he and Mary stayed home and fought the Battle of Bedford Falls, as they say, running scrap drives, rubber drives, paper drives, and operating as air raid warden, and Mary running the USO while having 2 more babies.
Exactly. And just so I don't forget just to reference a couple of things that Chris has talked about, in our follow-up email, we'll share the every single word video that National Museum of American History had created based on Annie's lines in the film. So that'll be a link we can direct people to, and we'll have a few other pieces that we reference in the follow-up email that the Historical Society will send out. But This is a question, Chris, that gets asked a lot, and I don't always agree with it. The way it's been submitted is film historians, and I would say some film historians have noted that It's a Wonderful Life is a pessimistic look at human existence. Why do you think this film resonates with audiences?
Well, I mean, I think I think there's a lot of reasons. One of the reasons I'd say that the reasons I'd say it resonates with me is, I mean, on the one hand, the acting. I mean, I think that there's such good performances in this, and I think the film is just so, well done and tight and so forth. But I think also because the film is real. I mean, I don't think this wasn't really intended to be, and when you think about it, it takes the ultimate struggle in the film takes place on Christmas Eve, but most of the film is not about Christmas at all. It's not happening then and so forth, and really is this long look at someone's life, and to the extent that it is about and on Christmas, it's about someone contemplating suicide at Christmas. It's about someone, suffering with depression, at Christmas, and so I think that part of it is it's darkness, it's reality. Again, I think if someone pitched this film today, it definitely wouldn't end up on the Disney Channel, because it's got such dark themes. But also you have to remember when it came out. I mean, it came out in 1946. Jimmy Stewart himself had come back from flying missions in 4-engine bombers, and was suffering from PTSD from that. Didn't think he ever wanted to go back to Hollywood and start acting after the things that he'd seen and done and experienced. And so I think that probably, Jimmy Stewart was able to use that trauma that he's experienced in this portrayal of George Bailey, which is dark and and emotional, and again, George Bailey isn't even likable in much of the movie. There's these explosions of temper at his children, at his wife, at his elderly uncle, at all sorts of people, at strangers, his children's teachers, and so forth. So I mean, and goes off to drink at the bar and drown his sorrows in that way. And so I think partly it's because the emotions are so real that it's not a saccharine sweet sort of story. And at the end, it's not even really a happy ending. I mean, Henry Potter never gets any comeuppance. He has the money. He's, almost ruined the building and loan. Who knows what's, going to happen. And George is, somewhat out of the woods with this immediate issue, but it's not like a complete, like ultimately he realizes that he's had a wonderful life because he's done good things for other people, but he doesn't become wealthy. It's not that sort of ending either.
And I think, to me, I always like to think that, not quite sure if we'll share the Saturday Night Live alternate ending to It's a Wonderful Life with Dana Carvey and company in it, but we may put that into our list of resources. But I always like to think that, somehow Potter does get his comeuppance. That's my ending. And I think too, just to put it in a historical perspective, the kind of counter to this film, that it's nominated for Best Picture of the Year for an Academy Award, but The Best Years of Our Lives, based on I think first a poem and then moves into a short story by McKinley Cantor, who's also an Iowan. That's a more realistic and short look at the veteran experience in after World War II, and that does win Best Picture. And so it's not that this film isn't successful; it doesn't make a profit, but it was nominated for 5 Academy Awards. So it has its challenges, but the final line essentially is that no man is an island, that we're all connected to each other. No man's a failure who has friends. So I had one quick question that I'm going to answer, and then I'll give us one last one to handle, Chris. Someone asked, why we think, or why I think, I'll take this one, Donna Reed's so popular. She grows up in a rural setting. She's kind of quintessentially Iowan, is the first woman Iowan to win an Academy Award. In fact, as an adult, is the first actor serving in an acting role to win an Academy Award. She does that for From Here to Eternity. I think she doesn't get as appreciated much for her ability to play a character, but when she's cast well, like as Mary Bailey, she does a nice job and does a fabulous job. And so as Alma, or in From Here to Eternity, she wins or earns the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. So the fact that you've got this farm girl who grows up in the Depression, who goes off to Hollywood and does well and plays great characters too, endears her to Iowans. So I know we'll probably take a couple minutes on this, so we'll run a little past 1 o'clock, Chris, but it's now considered a holiday classic. What more recent or modern holiday films do you think might, oh no, I don't like that one, sorry. I want to go with the other one, which is, why do you think this resonates? Why does this film resonate with audiences? Sorry, whoever asked the question on what might take its place, but why do you think this film resonates with audiences as a classic?
Well, so one of the reasons is, so as you said, it was sometimes we say, or sometimes it is said that this film wasn't a box office success. And, it was fairly successful at the time. And as you said, that it won awards and so forth, and people saw it. Eventually its copyright ran out and it was just available to be seen, and it was played on, you didn't really need to, TV stations didn't need to pay anything to play it. So they did a lot. And so in the 70s and particularly 80s, I think it gained so much more popularity because it was just on all the time, and it could be seen over and over again. And then people did, and I think a lot of new generations, discovered it. Again, I think it's a really solid story with amazing acting, and it's not your typical Christmas, film. And I think, for me anyway, those are the stories, those are the things I want to watch more at the holiday time. And I think that this this really deep and important lesson, also, frankly, I grew up, I went to Jesuit schools, and where our motto was "Men for Others" and so forth. So for me, George Bailey, it was always just a life lesson as well, that you, and also really connects well with my work and studying the American Civil Rights Movement. And I remember at one point when I got to interview Congressman John Lewis, and he said, one of the things, that story, his story, Rosa Parks' story, those people who made differences in that same way as George Bailey did, he said, you may not have a lot of money, you may not have a lot of power, but if you live a good life like that, you have what Dr. King and Gandhi and others called soul power. I see that in George Bailey so much. And so I think that it's, there are great lessons, to be had with that. And I think the other reality of it that the film shows is, the rewards for that are not obvious. The rewards for that are not material and so forth. And, George gives up a lot to have this wonderful life, and, and deals with a lot of stresses on it. And so you see, it's not an easy journey. It's not a saccharine sort of story that if you just serve others, everything will be fine. If you serve others in that way, things may still go badly for you. But ultimately, I think that is that it's shown as a rewarding life.
And thank you, Chris. And so with that answer, we'll bring the webinar to a close. And I want to say thank you to all of our attendees who joined us today. And also thank you to Chris for joining me, helping out the State Historical Society of Iowa with this program. Please join us in 2022 as we continue our Iowa History 101 webinar series, the first taking place on January 13th. Be sure to check our website at iowaculture.gov to learn more about all of our programs. Thank you all again. Have a great afternoon and happy 175th on December 28th.